Illegal relationship? Margot Chambers loved and adored her husband. Bruce was everything she wanted in a man, with his barrel chest and strong jaw, running his construction company like a king. No one messed with Bruce Chambers. Even nearly 20 years later, Margot was proud to bear his name. He was a fantastic lover, a wonderful father to their 2 children, a patient man with her son from her first marriage, who had been living separately with his father for the past few years. Although the frequency of their sex life had decreased somewhat over the years, the quality of it hadn't changed. Bruce was as assertive, passionate, and fearless as he had been when they first met, and Margot loved being his wife. So when Margot answered the phone one afternoon and heard a woman crying on the phone, her first reaction was bewilderment. There was no way it could be Carol, the office manager of Bruce's company, the most serious and reserved woman Margot had ever known. And what she was saying between sobs was also impossible. Bruce was a trim man of 55. He worked out at their basement gym and went jogging almost every night. A man like that wouldn't just faint. Even if he did, he would be in an ambulance somewhere, rushed to a hospital where he would fight for his life and win. This is Bruce Chambers we're talking about. He has never lost a fight in his life. But when the phone was handed over and Margot heard the somber, calm voice of Bruce's business partner, Ray, it all became real. Bruce had collapsed in his office and died before the ambulance even got there. Heart failure, they said. If Margot wanted to see her husband, she'd have to go to the hospital morgue. Margot finished talking, dropped to her knees, and howled in pain like a mother bear in a snare. Everyone had been so kind. Her family, her friends, everyone Bruce worked with, all of them had shown more love and support than Margot could have hoped for. Even her first husband, Jim, had called her to offer his condolences. They had a pleasant half-hour conversation during which he promised to talk to Lucas. Their son was 23 years old, and he hadn't spoken to Margot in 5 years. Perhaps this could be the first step toward reconciliation. Bruce's parents were alive, and he had a sister. Of course, they were all devastated, but the funeral expenses were shared with Margot. The service was held in a huge church and was well attended. Bruce was popular, a pillar of the community. As Margot sat in the front row and watched 17-year-old Jerry and 14-year-old Tom stand up and give eulogies in honor of their father, she was proud of them. Both Jim and Lucas appeared, dressed in dark, neat clothes rather than the strict black suits and ties most men wore. Father and son had intended to sit in the very back row of the church, but Margot's parents wouldn't hear of it. Margot felt a pang of jealousy as Lucas hugged his grandparents. She collapsed onto her late husband's casket, and she wanted Bruce's strong arms around her. The whole mess with Lucas never seemed so awful when a big, strong man cradled her against his big, strong chest. After the funeral, people came up to the next of kin to offer their condolences. Margot tried to focus on the people who approached her, but her heart was racing. Jim and Lucas joined the line of sympathizers, and in less than a minute she was actually looking into the eyes of her oldest child. A child? Margot had been 24 when she'd given birth to Lucas, only a year older than he was now. She'd heard his voice when he talked to his half-brother and sister, and here he was, a young man in a neat dark shirt and jacket, looking at the 47-year-old woman he used to call Mom. She could still see the rage in his eyes, but he was clearly determined to respect the situation. Margot was very proud of him, but she had the good sense not to say it out loud. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I'm so glad to see you." She was sincere. Indeed, it was so obvious that she meant it that both parties were a little puzzled. Lucas swallowed and looked at the brooch holding her neckerchief in place. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. He nodded dryly and walked away. Margot turned her head and watched him walk across the grass between the headstones. Jim walked over and stood beside her, following her gaze. Margot cleared her throat. "Perhaps we can chat later?" she asked. "Of course," Jim said. But when the gathering moved on to the wake at Margot and Bruce's luxurious home, Jim and Lucas were no longer in sight. For the headstone, Margot had chosen a classic vertical rectangle of polished granite, sturdy and uncomplicated. It seemed right for Bruce. Along with his name and dates, it was carved with the inscription, "A fearless husband and loving father." He would have loved it. Margot visited the grave almost every day. Her sense of emptiness was almost constantly felt in her chest. So the still stone block was a comfort. It reminded her of the need to be fearless herself. She had 2 children approaching adulthood, and they needed her to be strong. Her friends told her she was an attractive woman, but Margot couldn't even think of anyone else right now. Bruce had taken out a life insurance policy, typical of him to think of such things, and she had also inherited his share of the construction company. Still, Margot wasn't ready to think about that, so she focused on being careful with the money she had. One late October afternoon, some 6 months later, Margot was walking through the churchyard on her daily visit when something made her stop like a dug-in on the path. At Bruce's grave was a woman squatting in front of the headstone, the way someone might squat in front of a baby. Margot could only see her from behind, but her long, black, slightly curly hair and stylish clothes gave her an immediate sense of feminine appeal. The woman was resting her hand on a granite stone, and Margot felt like yelling at her to stop touching it. The woman straightened up. She was petite, but she stood tall, her black-heeled boots visible from beneath the hem of her long, honey-brown coat. She kissed her fingers and moved the kiss to the top of the headstone. After waiting a moment, she turned to leave. Margot felt her throat constrict. She guessed the woman was attractive, but she hadn't been prepared for how beautiful the young woman's face was. She had dark eyes and lashes, slightly coarse eyebrows, and there was liveliness in her expression, as if she found the world wonderful and attractive. The woman was heading for the churchyard gate, which meant she had to pass Margot. Their eyes met for a moment, and the black-haired woman nodded politely to Margot, about to step around her. Margot glared back fiercely. "Who are you?" she asked. The woman stopped like a dummy. "I beg your pardon?" I said, "Who are you?" "It's none of your business who I am. My husband's grave is over there, so I think it's my business." The woman blinked. Then her face broke into a wide, surprised smile. "Oh my God! You're Margot!" Margot stepped back as if the woman had hit her. The woman whined and shook her head. Then the smile returned, a little shyly, and she looked at Margot with a kind of warmth, as if they were comrades who had been swindled by the same crook. Margot did not smile back. "I asked you a question." "Yes, I see," said the woman. "And if you are Margot, I will gladly answer it. But before I do, I have a question for you." The young woman straightened up and looked Margot in the eye. "Do you really want to know who I am?" Margot suddenly felt a bad feeling. The cold feeling that had just rumbled through her stomach was telling her that she wasn't going to like what this woman had to say. What made it worse was that the warning was probably genuine. Margot knew from experience how hard it was to brush off painful things unless the person telling you was motivated by malice. But if this woman walked away without telling her anything, Margot would always wonder who she was, or rather, who she was. To Bruce. Margot guessed that Bruce had probably slept with this woman, but what else was there, and how often? It was probably better to know for sure than to let her imagination play out. "Tell me," softly. "All right," the woman said. "I've warned you." The woman straightened up. Margot pulled herself together. "I'm a sex worker, and Bruce was my client." "My husband did not go to a sex worker." As a matter of fact, he didn't, but I had him. "I don't believe you." "Oh, that's fine. No problem." The woman turned to leave. Margot was out of her mind. "Why would he go to a sex worker?" she exclaimed. "Look, Margot. Can I call you Margot?" What should I call you? You can call me Faya. Is that your professional name? It's the name Bruce knew me by. Faya looked at the tombstone with a pensive expression on her face. He never knew my real name. Margot stared at the woman, trying to figure out what this illicit relationship might have been. There was clearly more to it than money, despite what Faya had said. "How did you find him?" Margot asked. "I hadn't seen him for months," said Faya. "It was normal. Then one night I got bored, so I Googled him. That's when I came across the obituary. It's unfortunate. He was a special person." "Why was he special to you?" "Oh, it's a long story." Faye seemed to have an idea. She looked at Margot, sizing her up. "I charge $300 an hour if you're interested in hearing more. I'm not going to pay you for a story. I can make you anything you want." "Don't you think I have a right to know?" "Honestly, no." Faya gave her a charming smile. "I'm going to have lunch at that little tea house I saw on the way. And if I don't see you again, I wish you a pleasant life." Faya started down the path. She had an easy, swaggering gait that annoyed Margot to no end. Margot had always thought she and Bruce had had an exceptionally good sex life, and the thought that he might not have felt the same was a terrible blow. But what could have been missing? Margot was ready for anything, any kinky thing they could imagine. Bruce always said how lucky he was to be married to such a sexually adventurous woman. Okay, Faye was younger, but that couldn't be the reason, could it? Margot walked over to Bruce's headstone. In her mind, the inscription now read, "A treacherous asshole and a lying cheat." "What the hell, Bruce?" she shouted to the granite rectangle. Faye sat at a small round table covered with a white lace tablecloth and looked out the window, framed by frilly floral curtains. She had just finished a surprisingly tasty Caesar salad and was wiping the corner of her mouth with a napkin when a lush-breasted Margot burst into the tiny establishment. The bell above the store door rang like an alarm, but Faya smiled and beckoned her in. Margot walked past the other customers to a table by the window, her face darkening. "Please have a seat," Faya said, pointing to a vacant chair. Margot plumped into the chair, placing her bag on her lap. She looked furious. "I suppose you want cash?" she asked angrily. "I'm afraid so. My purse is a little small for a credit card machine." Margot held out freshly rolled-up bills from the ATM across the table. Faya took the money and slipped it into her purse without checking it. The waitress, an older woman and owner of the tea shop, came over to put the dishes away. Faya gave her a dazzling smile and ordered tea for two. Watching her, Margot could clearly sense that Faya was enjoying herself. "So," said Faya as the waitress left, "where would you like to start? How did you first meet Bruce?" "I used to work at a gentleman's club. There was a bar and a small dance floor and private rooms that could be rented by the hour. Myself and the other girls would chat up the men, talk them into buying us drinks, and if they were in the mood, take them upstairs for special favors." "Sounds charming," with a smirk. Not a word I would have used, but the club was clean, shiny, and very expensive. I was making good money. A waitress came over with a tray with a full tea set on it. There was a small round teapot with matching cups and saucers and a matching milk pot and sugar bowl. On a tiny matching mini saucer were 4 chocolates. Faya looked at the ensemble and flashed one of her dazzling smiles. "Now that's what I call charm." The waitress smiled as she rearranged the tea items on the table. "You have a lovely place," Faya said, "and the salad was excellent." "Well, thank you." The old woman turned pink, almost bowed, and left. Faya poured 2 cups of tea while Margot watched from under half-closed eyelids. "Speaking of charm," she said, "you're quite good at it." "Thank you, Margot." "Was this part of the club training?" "In a way," Faya replied coldly. "Part of my job is to make men feel good about themselves. It's like the opposite of being a wife." Margot bristled. "I've been nice to Bruce." "Really? What's that supposed to mean?" Listen, Margot, Faya said. Whenever I asked your husband why he married you, he always talked about how beautiful you were and how great the sex was. It was very important to him how great the sex was. And yet he paid to have sex with you? Not really. Faye sighed and took a sip of her tea, raising her pinky finger. Look, technically, yes. He'd sign me up for 2 hours, we'd get naked and have sex. But that was mostly at my insistence. I don't like taking money from a man and then not keeping my end of the bargain. And of those 2 hours, maybe 10 to 15 minutes were spent in sexual activity. Mostly we lay with each other and talked. About what? You. About business. About how hard it was for him to be a man. Never showing weakness, never showing fear, always giving the impression that he was on top of things. But he was always like that, Margot protested. He was exactly that kind of man. Margot, do you really believe there's such a thing as that kind of man? Only a psychopath is never afraid of anything. I'm sure of it. Well, Bruce didn't think there was. He realized that if he ever told you the truth about his fears and insecurities, you would lose your desire and leave him for another man. Why would he think that? Because that's what you did to your first husband. Margot turned pale. My God, how many secrets, personal details had Bruce shared with this woman? The cup of tea stood in front of her, untouched, cooling. Look, I'm not saying this to judge you, Faye said. I'm just saying that Bruce saw how you treated your first husband, so he was determined not to make the same mistakes again. He even said once, when Margot talks about her ex, it's like she's giving me a blueprint of what not to do. You shouldn't talk about what's bothering you, don't share how you really feel about something, and absolutely don't talk about thoughts that might include cutting back on spending, problems with making money, because that's what your first husband did. And Bruce told me that you never stopped marveling at what a relief it was for you to be with a real man who didn't put out such garbage. Faye smiled at her and filled her cup from the teapot again, as if they were talking about the price of eggs. Margot's jaw clenched. She looked out the tea house window and shook her head. That's not fair, she said. You can't compare the two men. Bruce was a real man, whereas Jim... Look, Jim is a good man, but he doesn't know how to be a man. He just wasn't fit to be a husband. Yeah, Bruce knew that's how you saw it, Faye said. That you didn't want him as he is. You wanted a fearless husband. That's not true. I told Bruce many, many times that I wanted him to be himself more than anything. Yeah, but that's what you told your first husband. And when he took you at your word and opened up, you told him he wasn't man enough and you left him. So when you said to Bruce, I want you to be yourself, he took it to mean, I want you to be the kind of husband I want you to be. That's a lie. He has fearless husband written on his tombstone. What more proof do you need? Margot jumped to her feet, pounding the table and nearly knocking over the cups. She was pale, her nostrils flared, and she stared intently at the other woman. But even as her rage overwhelmed her, when she spoke, there was desperation in her voice. You didn't know Bruce! You didn't know Bruce! No, you didn't know Bruce, Faya said calmly. And you weren't interested in meeting him. What you wanted was a perfect marriage, and if Bruce didn't give it to you, you would have left him for a man who would. What do you know about marriage? You're a cheater! Faye jumped to her feet. No! You're the cheater! She screamed. You're the one who cheated on your first husband and then made both men lie to the child about it. You took the little baby away from his father when Bruce moved in with you and then filed a false child abuse report to get away from your ex. Margot's eyes bulged with horror. Yes, he told me about it, Faya said fiercely. It was the first time we met. Bruce showed up at the club drunk, broken and self-destructive. He had just found out what you had done, so he was going to make love to a dozen girls and ruin his marriage. Ironically, I was the one who talked him out of it. Why should I believe that? I don't care if you believe it or not, but my own parents are divorced, so when I heard there were 3 children in the emotional cesspool you created, I thought I should at least try to help save the marriage. Faya grabbed her coat, put it on, and grabbed her purse. A waitress came over and stood nervously nearby, clearly wanting to intervene in the altercation but not quite sure how to do so. Faye threw her an apologetic look and put $50 on the table, almost double what was owed. Then, frowning, she pulled out the remaining bills and tossed them to the side of Margot's desk. "Here," Faya said. "Your payment." Faya turned and walked away. The bell on the door jingled as she opened it, and there was an awkward silence after it closed. Margot hadn't visited Bruce's grave in over a week. When she finally forced herself to go, she was surprised at how plain the headstone looked. Gray, nameless, nothing special. The phrase, "fearless husband," now seemed like a bad joke, and there was a streak of white bird shit running through his last name. Margot had a pack of baby wipes in her bag just for such an occasion, but she didn't bother this time. Let the rain wash it off. She left the churchyard and walked across town, trying to deal with her emotions. She was very, very angry, and as she walked through the market square, she realized that the reason for her anger was that she felt like a failure. She had married Jim thinking he was a real man, only to find out that there was nothing extraordinary about him. Then she met Bruce, went and did exactly the same thing. Margot remembered how Bruce's company had been under investigation by the fraud department a few years earlier. It had turned out to be the result of malicious rumors started by a competitor, and Bruce had sued their collective asses. But while it was still going on, it was a serious concern because even the possibility of a scandal could ruin them. Ray, Bruce's partner, had lost a lot of weight and looked like warmed-up death, with circles under his eyes and prematurely graying hair. Bruce, while troubled, maintained his confident demeanor, his positive attitude, and continued to pay a lot of attention to his wife. In a world full of scary people like Ray and Jim, Margot felt happy around a real man like Bruce. But now it turned out that Bruce was no different, that he was just as afraid of financial ruin as Ray was, and just as afraid of losing his children as Jim was. The only difference was that Bruce had managed to hide it, and Margot now remembered how many evening meetings Bruce had at that time, sometimes even on weekends. She felt cheated. Instead of dealing with his fears like a man, he'd run off to this little pint-sized girl. Margot realized that it wasn't the mental image of Bruce making love to Faye that bothered her so much. That would at least show some masculinity. No, it was the image of Bruce curled up on the bed, resting his head on the girl's lap, sobbing with fear as she stroked his hair and said, "Here we go, everything will be all right." Margot returned home and went straight upstairs to the bedroom. She started taking Bruce's clothes out of the closet and throwing them on the bed. She hadn't decided yet whether to sell or give them away to charity stores. But for now, she would roll everything up and put it in the spare room. When the kids got home, they could probably browse, just in case they wanted something as a keepsake. It took Margot less than an hour to get her late husband's things out of her living room and into the spare room. Then she made herself a cup of tea and turned on her computer. A friend had sent links to a couple of dating sites aimed at Margot's age group, plus another for dating potential cougars and boy toys. Margot decided to put together a profile for all the sites. She was an attractive woman in her 40s and thought she could expect to make a decent acquaintance. Besides, she had to give herself a chance to be with a real man for a change. There had to be some, didn't there? The end!